podcast is Christian. This podcast is Reformed. This podcast is post-millennial, optimistic, and reconstructionist. And this podcast is for fun. Welcome to episode 15 of Reconciled Radio. We're coming at you live again. No, we're not live, are we?
We're live.
I always say that. We're not live. But we are coming at you from the secret underground bunker in northern Michigan in a very desolate, dark, and dank underground room that is the studios of Reconciled Media. I'm joined by my co-host Jesse Samuel and our very special neighbor and guest, a very special boy. Joey Venegas. Say hello to the people.
Hello, people.
Hey, guys, we just got done interviewing Joel McDurmon, and it was a lot of fun. I will say that is the hardest. It was so hard to stop asking questions in this interview.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, most of our listeners are going to know who he is and be somewhat familiar with his work. If you're not, you need to be, but this will get you started. So hope you enjoy this interview. Love you guys. Episode 15. Here we go.
All right, welcome back. We have on today an amazing guest. He is an active lecturer, a radio show guest, and preacher. He has authored and edited several books, including Restoring America, One County at a Time, In the Midst of Your Enemies, an exposition and application of 1 Samuel, and, of course, The Bounds of Love, an introduction to God's Law of Liberty. These and many other books and lectures by Joel are available at AmericanVision.com. So please welcome to Reconciled Radio, Dr. Joel McDurmon.
Yeah, buddy. Welcome, Joel. Welcome.
Thank you, guys. I'm glad to be here.
Joel, there's one pressing question that I've been wondering for a long time. I call my mother-in-law Mom, and I call my father-in-law Pops. Do you call Gary North Dad?
Well, before I answer that, let me just say real quick about the introduction. I've been called a lot of things, and I've had a lot of praise and thanks directed my way in introductions before, but I think that's the first time I've ever been called amazing.
Well, you are, brother. You've been a blessing to the church.
To stroke my ego like that the whole time. This is going to go very well.
We'll do our best. Great job, Jesse.
I've never called Gary North Dad.
No?
No.
Okay.
You call him?
No, I call him
What was that?
Gary.
Oh, okay, good.
Nice. All right.
I was going to say Gary, sir.
That wasn't the answer I was hoping for, but anyway, let's move on.
Brian's lying, by the way. He doesn't call
his... It's a very interesting relationship. You know, it's always been very informal. Gary and I were friends first before I really got to know his daughter and married them. So those dynamics were already established on the lines of friendship, and I've always been looked up to him and been very respectful. And at first it was Dr. North and Dr. North that, but he's not that kind of formality type person. He'll bring you down to earth really quickly. And, you know, Gary North has this kind of thing that he'll yell at you. But he'll only yell at you if you're a complete idiot of like some kind of opponent who does not get the point yet keeps pressing it belligerently. He'll yell at you.
Okay.
And you don't want that. Then on the other hand, if he loves you well enough to make sure you get the point, he'll yell at you.
Okay.
Right.
That's good.
I've been yelled at a number of times for both reasons.
Yeah. You stick around long enough, you'll catch both of those, huh?
But you end up loving him because he's such a unique individual in so many ways. Just there's one Gary North, and that's it. And he is a very phenomenal individual, and I counted a huge blessing to have known him all these years.
I can imagine. That's great. Joel, everybody's expecting the follow-up to The Bounds of Love. And we are too, but there's one thing that I'm expecting more, and I want to know, when can we expect McDurmon's Grill YouTube channel?
Man, I've really thought about that a lot. If I had some spare time on my hands, I would do that, just for the fun of it, if for nothing else. Young men need to learn to cook and do those things.
Yeah.
But the other reason I don't is there are so many channels like that, man. There's so many guys out there showing you good stuff, Barbecue Pit Boys and a bunch of others out there that are just really phenomenal, teach you the basics, teach you a lot more than the basics, and, you know, Malcolm Reed's How to Barbecue Right channel. That guy is just so full of energy. He's a great big guy, and he does everything. He's a championship-level barbecuer, and there's so much great stuff out there that it's not even worth me trying to start something and make it something. But
yeah, so
maybe
Joel...
I'll put up a few videos.
Yeah, you got it. And I think, maybe there's a way that you blend the two worlds that you know and love and something like that. So, but I do want to give you a chance. If you're not going to start your own YouTube channel, here's the question I want to set you up with. For a guy who has never opened a grill before, what's your suggestion to him to get started in learning to love that art?
That's a good question. For a first-time opener,
yep,
I'd have to go find that video, but I would, because, I mean, the videos I started with, I already knew how to light a stack of charcoal,
Okay.
But if you haven't opened the box before, you don't know, you need to learn that first, because there's an art to doing that right. But so I'd have to go find a video or two for that.
Is there a type of meat that you would suggest trying to perfect first before you move on?
Yeah, like a very first time, man, just get a steak. Get a nice ribeye steak.
Okay.
And learn how to cook a steak. And there's tons of YouTube videos on that. You can find fine dining chefs showing you how they do that in the restaurant. You can find guys in the backyard on the grill showing you how to do that.
Right.
But that's one thing. Trying to do a brisket, that's a whole different world. Trying to do any kind of roast is a whole different world. Low and slow is different than a steak. So honestly, it's hard to go wrong. I say that only because that was my experience. But if there's so much help on YouTube, if whatever you want to do, watch a few videos and go do it because it's repeatable. It's not rocket science, and but it is science, so it's repeatable. And if somebody else is putting a piece of meat in the oven for 3 hours at 325, you can put a piece of meat in the oven at 3 hours, 325, and get basically the same results. So, start where you want to start. What do you like? That kind of stuff.
That's good advice right there.
And the other thing is, food it's a communal event. It's a way to have fellowship with other people. We had Bible studies at my house for a long time, a few years ago, trying to start a home church. And we would have 35 people here sometimes gather, and it was always the table that was the gathering event. The Bible study kind of followed that.
Yeah.
But the tight-knit core group was built around a table and sharing meals. And so if you're just wanting to learn to cook, maybe you need to learn it for yourself a couple of times because you might, turn out with a brick or a hockey puck or something. But ultimately, you want to get that roast or whatever and make it a communal event. Make that brisket or that pulled pork or whatever and do it for your family or for your buddies. Get together and have a few beers while you do it. That's where the heart of it is in the sharing part of it.
That's awesome. And that was what my follow-up question was going to be is what, something that you love about it. And that's so cool to hear your heart, just having the people around and the communal aspect of it. That's part of what makes you fall in love with it, huh?
Yeah, it is. And the other thing I like about it personally, and this may just be me nerding out a little bit, especially after writing this book where I spent tons of time going through the priestly code. God is very specific about how to deal with these animals that you sacrifice. And in some places, he's very specific about what you burn on the altar and what you don't burn on the altar. And the fat goes to me, he said. That's for me. So when you're putting a steak on the grill and you're sitting there watching that fat sizzle and drip a little bit, or you're rendering fat off of something, you're like, there's just connection to what's going on in Leviticus, And there's fire there's the altar fire there, and there's this sizzling going on. It's very interesting in the priestly code in Leviticus and Numbers, God made provisions for the priests to eat from certain of the animals that were sacrificed. But they were only allowed to eat the shoulder and I believe what was considered the leg, which would be something like it was the breast. It was the shoulder and the breast. Mm-hmm. Those were the only two pieces of meat the priests got to keep. So think about this. What is the shoulder and the breast on a lamb or a bull? That's the brisket, and that's the pulled pork shoulder. Okay? These are the toughest cuts of meat on the entire cow, just about, or whatever it is, animal. Those are the toughest cuts. So the priests were made provision. They got to eat, but they didn't get the filet mignon. They didn't get the choice cuts. They didn't get the fat. that was the good and bad around the kiddies. That was all for God. That went to God. But they had to learn all these things about how to make this meat edible and stuff. I just think there's a really interesting connection there. The toughest cuts of meats are also, by the way, the cheapest cuts, right? Which is why we have barbecue as a tradition that we do. Basically, the poor people got the cheap cuts of meat. They had to figure out how to cook these things to make them palatable. So the ribs, the shoulders, briskets, a lot of it comes out of slave culture, and then also Indian culture, but a lot of it comes from slave culture, and then after that, free black culture and urban black culture. And who in the world, where do you go for the best barbecue? Memphis, St. Louis,
South,
all of these places where those cultures developed these things, and in the Carolinas. So there's a lot of cultural tie-in to all this, not to mention that also how God expected the priests to eat in a very humble way.
Right.
And I know I'm rambling on this a bit, but there's a great story in my book on Samuel. I believe it's First Samuel. Sons of Eli are introduced as sons of Belial, as worthless men, and they become these degenerates who lead the Ark of the Covenant into captivity and all that. And what was their major infraction? Go read the story of them in 1 Samuel 2. What was their major infraction? Well, they committed all kinds of sins, including adultery. But the one God spends time describing to you is how they perverted the sacrifices. They were instructing their assistants to reach into the fire and pull out the best cuts of meat under the guise of getting the piece that they were supposed to be allotted as priests.
Wow.
They were having them pretend to randomly get the steak, the fillets, whatever. God describes it in terms that you clearly understand what they're doing. They're taking the best cuts of meat for themselves instead of for God.
We just got some barbecue theology, guys.
Yeah. Don't ever ask Joel McDurmon a question like this.
Well, you know what? That went even better than I was expecting. I was expecting to go well, but here's what I have to confess, because when we had you on, and I've been thinking about how we treat our guests, and I want our guests to have fun, and I want to make sure that you don't just get asked the same questions over and over. So you know what I did, and I'm going to confess this to our listeners. I reached out to Jordan Wilson and Jason Garwood, and I said, hey, we have McDurmon coming on today. What do you guys think I could ask him that he would really have fun with? And they both said, ask him about barbecue.
and he will go for the entire hour.
That's right.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is really cool.
Yeah, I'll give you one more. You want one more?
Absolutely.
Bring it.
My favorite story in the Bible is when David brings the ark back in to Jerusalem. I believe it's 2 Samuel 6. And he's leading this huge parade, and you know the story. He's dancing in an ephod, and one of his wives gets upset about that, and you're exposing yourself and all this stuff. But he leads the ark in, and he has a celebration, and the text makes a point of saying that David made the sacrifices, and he made sure that every person in Israel got a piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. So I'm like, okay, this guy knows how to throw a party, right? And he's making sure everybody's got a drink.
Praise God.
That is awesome. Yep.
Very cool.
I just want Joel to tell Bible stories all the time. Just make them like that. That is great. Well, as great as that is, we are going to shift gears a little bit. Yeah. All right. Well, just to get in some. Hey, we're talking about grilling, we're talking about steak, raw. Let's get into the meat of some things.
I like that transition.
Yeah, I'm full of them every once in a while. All right, so I have, just on a personal note, have really only been kind of into theonomy and things of that nature for, I don't know, maybe about a year, a little bit less, or just around that amount of time. And one thing that I have noticed, and it was kind of my thought process when I first got into it, was it seems like it's something that's really new. It's kind of like a new wave of thinking and things like that. I mean, maybe as early as the 80s and things like that. That's what I've heard from a lot of people, and I even kind of thought, because when you look at it, you don't see a whole lot of resources. You don't see, but then again, when you dive into it, you really see that there's a plethora of resources. But there actually is a rich history, going all the way back, through a lot of the major thinkers in our times, and we're talking hundreds of years. And one in particular that it makes me think of is Joel, you helped edit a book called The Disputations on the Law of Moses, or Biblical Law of Moses, right? Is that correct? Yeah, that one right there, Disputations on the Judicial Laws of Moses. That's it. So give us a little bit of background to that. That is about a Johannes Piscator. Correct? Am I saying that name right? Yep. And he wrote hundreds of years ago, essentially about theonomy, and it's something. Like I said, it's something that most people see as new, but this is something that has a rich history behind it. So, tell us a little bit about that, if you would, just a little snapshot of that, and then how that thinking kind of helped shape, later writings that everybody knows, like the Westminster Confession of Faith and things like that.
No doubt. As far as, I'll bring up Piscator in just a second. As far as theonomy being new or old, the answer is yes. It's in a way, it's both. I believe, I am a post-millennialist. I believe God's been developing his kingdom throughout history, and I believe that is true epistemologically also. We become, we understand Revelation better as we go through history, and so we can show this clearly in many ways. Just look at the progression of the creeds. Start out with the Apostles' Creed, then you have Arius, and the Nicene Creed comes out, the Athanasian Creed. The next thing you know, we've got the Reformation. Of course, I know I'm skipping 1,000 years there, but get the Reformation, the Heidelberg Catechism, and all these great things, the Westminster Confession. If you don't see development in detail of doctrine over time, you're not looking at church history. And the question of God's law has always been there in various ways, but certainly became an issue during the Reformation. And there's a lot of back history here that I write about in the foreword. But Johannes Piscator was a guy who, I wouldn't call him quite second generation. Maybe you should call him a second generation reformer. He was born in 1542, I believe. So Calvin would have been in his 30s when this guy was a baby. And but this guy was from the Reformed faith, and by that time, there were so many scholars pouring into the Reformed world from all over the place. There were two men, specifically one named Emmanuel Tremelius, who I believe was a converted Jew, and another colleague of his named Franciscus Junius. And they developed a theory about the application of the judicial laws of Moses in modern times. And I'm almost certain, I haven't been able to trace all of this because there's not much written about him or by him, but Tremelius, being a converted Jew, I'm almost certain that he had to have brought some understanding of that with him from the rabbinical world, or from maybe Talmudic tradition. That may be hypothesizing too much, I don't know. But it's those two guys that Piscator credits with influencing his understanding. And he basically said all the reformers understood that the moral law of the Old Testament, you're talking about the basic morals of right and wrong in the Ten Commandments and whatnot, all of them almost, depends on who you talk to and when you talk to them, especially in the Lutheran traditions. You never know what they're going to say at what time. Still generally good stuff. But they all believe the moral law followed through. But these judicial laws, they all believe the ceremonial laws were abrogated for the most part. They may have a tweak here or there. But the judicial laws were always this kind of outlier, and some people, it seems to me, almost just out of convenience said, no, they're done away. But everybody appealed to them for some reason, but it was never clear what their exegetical basis was.
Right.
It's in my understanding, Piscator says that Calvin was consistent with this. I disagree with Piscator on that. When we both get to heaven, we can talk about where he was wrong about that. But
that's awesome.
But he says it was consistent with Calvin. I don't necessarily think so. But nevertheless, he says the judicial laws are split. Basically, there's part of the judicial laws that are so clearly tied to the ceremonial system of Israel that they're clearly done away. And he would give some examples of that. But then there are other places, he says, that are clearly natural moral principles, restitution for theft, things like that. And so those continue forward. And so that's what he made clear in his appendix that we published. And this little book, Disputations on the Judicial Laws of Moses, it was nothing but an appendix of his in his commentary on the Old Testament. This guy wrote an entire commentary on the entire Old Testament in Latin.
Wow.
And it's just sitting out there untranslated, along with the tons of other post-Reformation scholastic.
Okay, I was just going to ask that. It's not translated. It's still sitting out there in Latin.
The vast majority of it, no. And there's tons of material from a ton of authors that's like this. Mm-hmm. But this fellow I know happened to find this, and it's just an appendix. Piscator got to Exodus 21 through 23, which is the case laws that appended to the Ten Commandments, the judicial law of Moses, and he did a separate appendix on that, arguing that these still apply, and here's how.
Interesting.
And that's what we ended up publishing. So that was published for the first time, as we can tell, in 1604. So Calvin died in 1564. This would have been 40 years after Calvin died. And it didn't make waves. You don't see it picked up all across Europe among the other reformers, but you do see it picked up among several of them who studied, especially those who studied in Hebraic studies, which, by the way, is a whole other story going on right now. And I haven't had a chance to search all this out. Somebody needs to write this history, but nobody has, as far as I know. But you remember what happened in 1492, right? Mm-hmm. What famous event happened in 1492? Tell me.
That was Luther born or nailed the 95 Thesis? No, that was 15. Yep.
So 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, right? That's America. But the other thing that happened in that same year, from the same country, Portugal and Spain, they expelled the Jews from the nation. And those Jews went out all across Europe trying to find free places to settle because they were persecuted almost everywhere. They end up in Amsterdam. They end up, I believe, maybe in Basel. Some of them end up in England eventually. So from the whole time the reformers are getting going, all the way up until the 17th century and early 18th century, there's this entire body of literature among scholars in the Reformed traditions studying Hebraic studies, because there's a massive immigration of Jews everywhere in the major urban centers, and everybody's trying to figure out, what do these people believe? What are they doing here? What's their law teach? And how does it relate to Christianity? How do you evangelize Jews? Should we even allow the Jews to be here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And you have massive titans of scholarship at this time. Johannes Buxtorf, John Selden, huge international names, who are essentially Hebraists or Hebraic scholars. And so Piscator was in that world, and the guys who also studied all that material, several of them end up being influencers of the Puritan movement in England. William Perkins, basically the teacher of many of the Westminster divines, and several of the divines themselves. George Gillespie being a prominent one, and there were many others. Samuel Rutherford was very well studied on the legal literature of the day, which included much of the Hebraic studies. And like I said, John Selden, who was also, I believe, at Westminster. So all of these guys bring in all this body of material that you can actually see them quoting Piscator directly as they're arguing Westminster Chapter 19 in do the judicial laws apply or not. So George Gillespie especially writes at length on this, and he quotes Piscator at length, his specific formulations. So that's how we know, and you may have this in your list of questions down the line. Maybe I'm way ahead of you, I don't know. But this is how you know that when the Westminster Assembly talks about the judicial laws, the general equity thereof applying, the judicial laws no longer apply today any more than the judicial equity the general equity thereof requires. Well, when they use that phrase, general equity, they're appealing to the doctrines that Piscator taught.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Because the general equity was the other half of what was called particular equity. Particular equity was those laws that only applied particularly to the Hebrew Commonwealth in the Old Testament. That was Piscator's distinction.
Wow.
When he said But the general equity, those are the laws within the judicial laws that still apply to all places and all times. Restitution for theft, death penalty for murder, rape, and kidnapping, things of that nature. He says this is general equity. This is for all nations and all times. That's what the Westminster Divines were drawing from when they used that language. So there's been so many mistakes and misguided attempts to understand that if you don't understand this intellectual tradition, this theological tradition, going through Gillespie, going through several of the other divines speaking at the time, you don't understand what that language means.
That's crucial. Wow.
Yeah, wow. Absolutely.
Well, that is really cool. That is exactly the history that I wanted to hear about. I'm a sucker for history too, so that's great. I'm probably going to shift gears again a little bit because I think that was you actually hit a lot of the questions I was going to have. So that's
so it's nice having you. And
we got a few more for you. Yeah. But do you guys got anything before we?
Yeah, I got a few. Man, I just read your book, The Bounds of Love, which, by the way, and I'll just say this: would not call myself a theonomist.
He talks like a theonomic post-mill reconstructionist. He just won't admit it.
Okay,
that's fine.
Moving on. No, I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was really good. And so I really have just some basic questions. I really would like to know what is the theonomic principles of interpreting the scriptures? Like, what are some basic principles of interpretation when it comes to understanding how the Old and New Testament work together there? And obviously this will work into some covenant theology and things like that. And so maybe if you could we could start there, and then I'd like to jump into chapter 3 of the Cherem Principle and talk about that. Yeah.
So in other words, define the universe and give 2 examples.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Okay. So principles of theonomic interpretation. Well, again, obviously there are some disputes and disagreements over how we explain this. The famous phrase is from Greg Bahnsen, who said, "The abiding validity of the law in exhaustive detail." And, I think that's overkill, and I think it causes more confusion than necessary. And in fact, there's a whole chapter in my upcoming book explaining why I think he was wrong about that, to use that way.
How dare you?
Now, yeah, I know. I'm going to make lots of friends with my
chapter.
I'm sure you're excited to make lots of friends over it.
My already long list of friends gets shorter by the day.
I'll be your friend, Joel.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
You bet.
I'm going to need it, so I'll keep that in reserve. The general idea has always been we should presume that the laws abide in the New Covenant era unless they're explicitly repealed in the New Testament.
Right.
And I was not satisfied with that. As a very vague generality, that's how I look at it. But the thing is, Bahnsen's greatest problem was he always said that, and you would say, okay, well, where are the discontinuities? Well, he never told you what they were. He might say the ceremonial laws, but he would never say what they were and why, and come to get really detailed about it. So that someone like a Vern Poitras, who's essentially holds our view, would say, well, what about this law? And Greg would have this visceral reaction like, no, you're defying the entire Bible if you feel. He's had these like over-the-top reactions to the fact that you pointed out there might be one discontinuity here. And well, by the time it was over, it was like Bahnsen wouldn't allow any discontinuity. But then if you said, well, okay, so your theory says everything's applicable. Oh, no, we have to even deny that just as vehemently. So it was always a problem. Where do you draw these lines and how do you tell? So the more I studied it, the more I realized they're not just places in the New Testament where you get a very clear abrogation of a law.
Sure.
And in fact, there's not much of that to begin with.
Yeah.
What you get are types of laws or genre of law that you read through Hebrews and it says, well, okay, there was a temple there and then there was a priesthood, but if there's a change of priesthood, then there's a change of law. Well, okay, That tells you a whole lot. Okay, we know for a fact the entire Old Testament priesthood came to an end. We know the temple system came to an end. And when you start reading through Leviticus painstakingly, comparing it to the Gospels, comparing it to Acts, but then you can't just stick on that really kind of analytical level of the text. That sounds terrible, like I'm departing from the text or something. That's not what I mean. But the literal readings of text and, oh, well, this is repeated here, so that law stays or whatever. There's a lot of biblical theology there. Yeah. I mean, the fact that the temple is destroyed, or going to be destroyed in AD 70, and you'll see a lot of this in my upcoming book. You see the apostles come out on the day of Pentecost, and what happens? There's a sound like a mighty rushing wind. They all began to speak with tongues. The Spirit gives utterance, and tongues of fire light upon each one of their heads. Does anybody here, raise your hand, know what that is? That is God showing the entire nation of Israel, which at that time has come in from all over the world, right, for the feast. He's showing the entire nation of Israel what the new temple is, because his fire altar presence just fell and descended upon it. The Jews had been waiting for the entire intertestamental period for the Shekinah glory of God to fall and his fire presence on the altar to light. The second temple never had that. It's in the rabbinical text. Everybody knew this. Yeah, we got this nice temple here, but there's no presence of God here.
Yeah.
Okay? But what happens on the day of Pentecost? God anoints his new body with the baptism of fire. That's the temple. What does Peter later say? You are the temple of living stones. What does Paul say? Your body is the temple. Etc. It's just repeated over and over. Okay? But that's not didactically stated in Acts chapter 2.
That's right.
This, by the way, this fire falling is the altar fire. That's God's presence. You guys have been waiting. It's not there. It's just an image.
Right.
And I can show you this in a dozen instances throughout Scripture of the tree of life and the temple that God is building with the river flowing out of it, the tree of life that leads to heal the nations. That's in Genesis. That's in the Old Testament tabernacle imagery. That is in Ezekiel's temple imagery specifically, which is a spiritual temple. That's in Revelation 22. Coincidence? Not at all. Not at all. So when you begin to understand these things a little differently, you start understanding the Scriptures better, and you realize that some of those types and genres of laws that are being done away with, you understand, well, yeah, of course, now I understand. We don't need a priesthood anymore. And everything that was tied to the priesthood is gone. As a new priest comes, there's a change of law. We have a new law.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm rambling on this because it's a huge topic and a lot of it's fresh in my mind, a lot of these very cool details.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And when you get into biblical theology, that happens. You get off into details more than systems. But so we assume continuity, but at the same time, there is discontinuity, and the imagery shows us this in many ways, as well as the text shows us this in many ways. But one of the areas, I just lost my train of thought.
So I think,
go ahead.
Yeah, it's important. I think that's a good distinction. You assume the continuity, but you have to put the work in to recognize the discontinuity, because it's not just going to hit you in the face like we want it to.
It never does.
Right.
It never does, and sometimes it's counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. Prophecy is like this, and prophecy plays directly into this. Mm-hmm. A verse I did not cover in Bounds of Love is covered in the new book clearly. And that is the fact that the prophecy of Zechariah calls for the end of the Cherem penalty. It specifically says this will end.
Yeah.
Does it end? It's actually quoted in the New Testament where it ends at, and you'll understand why. Okay. The last word of the last verse of the last chapter of the last book of the Old Testament, the very last word of the Old Testament is the word Cherem. And that is the prophecy of Malachi, that if they don't listen to the John the Baptist figure that was coming, and if they don't listen to the Son of Righteousness with healing in his wings, God is going to smite the earth with a curse, Cherem.
Wow. Yeah.
God was bringing the judgment of Deuteronomy 13, the rebellious city, upon the rebellious people of Israel who cast away the Messiah. But Zechariah tells us that there will come a day in which there's going to be a kingdom of God in which there is no more Cherem.
Yeah.
Okay. So we see discontinuity there. The question is, how do we understand when that unfolds, when it takes place? The end of the temple system comes in AD 70 when it's destroyed, but that whole intergenerational period there is unclear. Zechariah, in that same prophecy that begins in Zechariah 12 and goes all the way to the end of the book, Zechariah 14, In that same prophecy, there's a famous prophecy, this prophecy that's repeated in the New Testament. And they will look upon him whom they have pierced, and all the tribes of the land will mourn. Yeah. Right? John tells us that prophecy is fulfilled when Jesus is on the cross and the soldier pierces his side with the spear. And he says this was done to fulfill what was said by the prophet. They will look upon him whom they pierced. Okay? That same prophecy is repeated in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, that God is going to come back in glory, in judgment, and they will look upon him whom they have pierced, and all the tribes of the land will mourn. Well, if you take that like I do to be AD 70, then you've got 40 years of gap in between when that prophecy was first said to be fulfilled and when it's at the end of when it's said to be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? There's something eschatological also. Yeah, so if you don't understand all these things together and how the old covenant was passing away and the new covenant was coming in, you won't understand a lot of these things. But it's definitely tied to the temple system, definitely tied to the priesthood. And here, to get back to a very short, succinct answer to your question, following the work of Gary North and a lot of the development of it that I've done, with some of James Jordan and Vern Poitras' help and a few others, if it's tied to the land of Israel or the temple or the priesthood or the seed laws, those things are all part of that old covenant system that are done away. But we know that the law is not done away in its entirety, because when God specifically says, I'm going to replace the old covenant with the new covenant, it's specifically in terms of the law. Yep. I'm going to get rid of all that old stuff, and I'm going to make a new one. It's not going to be like Sinai. They're not going to be able to break it the way they did, but I'm going to write my law in their hearts. Well, right, there's the law again. Mm-hmm. So some part of the law continues. What is that? And that's where I usually start with establishing continuity. There has to be the law continuing. Yep. And I look at it, and Gary North hits on this too in an appendix that I'm reprinting in the new book. He hits on this concept independently. We both did. The law is crucified with Christ. It's fulfilled in Christ. It is buried with him, and it is resurrected with him. But just as his resurrection body was the same body, but yet it was a different body. Mm-hmm. It's not a glorified body. It's the same law, but it's a glorified law.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm.
So that's a general way to understand it. And then we can start talking in more detailed terms about continuity and discontinuity.
Yeah, that was an interesting point, man. At the end, I've never thought about it that way. Would you say too, with what obviously when you say he's buried with Christ, like the conditionality of the law, especially for the people of Israel, would you say that is also buried? Because I mean, like when you read like Exodus 19, parts of Deuteronomy, I mean, there's clear conditionality that's really rooted in the nature of the law. Would you say that also is buried there?
And it depends on what conditionality you're talking about. Are you talking about the verses that say, if you continue in this law and obey it, then you shall live?
Yeah, lots of things like that. Yeah.
Certainly, I think that is part of what God was saying when this is not going to be like the old covenant, which they broke. Okay. Yeah. But he says, I'm going to write my law in your hearts and in your minds, and no one will have to teach them anymore. They will all know me. So that there's a sense in which they will not be able to break. And boy, if you want to talk about bringing your Calvinism in, that really does it. Because all of the people who are legitimately in the invisible church of the new covenant, not a single one of them will ever not know the Lord after that point.
That's right.
And nobody will have to teach them to know the Lord. Their knowing of the Lord in general is his work 100%, and it is steadfast, solid, immovable forever. Mm. So in that sense, definitely different than the old covenant. There is no conditionality. It's God's promise, and it's God's character to fulfill that promise, and you never have to worry about it. Hmm. So yes, but on the other hand, there were also historical sanctions in the old covenant where God says, if you disobey me, I'm going to bring plague upon you and poverty and war. I still believe God judges nations and peoples in those terms according to obedience to his law. So there is still a conditionality when it comes to what you might call social theory or social justice.
Yeah, no, that's
excuse
good.
me. Did I just interject a term there?
Hey, be careful now. Come on, you know better than that.
Triggered.
We're going to have to bleep that out.
That was awesome. The Cherem Principle,
Is he saying it right? We need to clear the record.
Yeah.
Yes, Cherem.
Okay, well, because I always wondered, because it's like Cherem, or do you have to get like that Hebraic ha in there, like Cherem?
Yeah, and in fact, in Hebrew, there's actually a soft and a hard ha.
Yep.
So there's two letters. One would be an H, and the other one would be more like a K sound, but it's a CH. So it's the letter he, or if I remember, maybe I even have that wrong now. I always forget my alphabet names. But anyway, it's like the CH in the name Bach.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, really asking the important questions there.
Yeah.
That's
important.
Well, you know what? So many people stumble over that. I'm actually putting a little paragraph or two in the introduction to make that
cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and the reason I think we want to get into this, because, your new book is primarily covering that. I mean, this Consuming Fire, that's the title, right? The Consuming Fire, Holy of Holies and the Law of God?
Yes, a Consuming Fire, the Holy of Holies and Biblical Law.
Biblical Law. Cool. Yeah,
it's
and
be a defense of the Cherem Principle. So it actually is expounding the Cherem doctrine from the beginning to the end of Scripture. And then part 2 is historical and modern scholarly interactions with the concept, which, everyone says I made this up. And everyone who said that or believed it is going to be absolutely shocked at the historical body of literature and testimony that's behind this concept.
Yeah.
And the amount of scholarly work on it being done right now by some of our own Reformed theologians, Trimper Longman, G.K. Beale, people have weighed in on this concept in many ways, different ways. And then part 3 is nothing but answering critics of the concept. It's probably half of the book, 100 pages or so.
Wow.
This maybe is more. I don't have this question written down, but it's more of maybe a history question, because I've heard people say that this is new. You've made that stuff up. Is there? I mean, obviously you really dug into history. You said a bunch of stuff I didn't know earlier. Is obviously there has to be some type of historical scholarship that obviously points to something like this. This isn't just something you came up with and you're like, I'm going to talk about this principle and I'm going to make it up. That's not how this came about. And I think it's probably unfair of a lot of people to say stuff like that. I mean, there's hours of study and that gets involved into these things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to blame people too much. I mean, when R.C. Sproul started doing talks on predestination back in the 1970s, everyone was like, what is this new stuff he's
That's
talking
right.
about?
Wow. Yeah.
The theology gets lost in the histories and for different reasons. So talk about the Cherem doctrine has been lost, but if you open up, I think it's the 4th volume of Herman Bavinck's Dogmatics and turn to the section on excommunication, you will read a paragraph in there where he says, you know what, there's this Jewish doctrine of excommunication called Cherem, and here's how they practiced it and stuff. And he actually lists the Hebrew word in there and translates it.
Wow, interesting.
And he got that directly from Francis Turton. And then when Louis Berkhoff in the 40s, I believe, wrote his famous systematic theology, he basically copied what Bavinck wrote as classic Dutch Reformed scholarship passing. And Berkhoff, you can open Berkhoff's systematic theology right there and see him use the word right there, transliterated from the Hebrew. They spell it differently because they transliterate the letters a little differently. It's Cherem instead of Cherem, but it's the same concept. And that's just a smidgen. I mean, it goes way back before the Reformation into the Middle Ages, and actually goes all the way back into the rabbinical era of the New Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, and of course into the Old Testament text. So, but when people say I made it up, I for the most part, I don't mind, because most people they don't understand. And it's like I said, with theological concepts get lost. People were writing about this in the 19th century in the scholarly journals, but not everybody reads that stuff.
Right, sure.
But it's the critics, the guys who are pastors or doctors, so-called, or people who actually are doctorates, who just knee-jerk say, oh, you made this up. This has never been taught in church history. And those guys, I want to slap them around a little bit. Deserve it. because they should know. They should at least go hit the books before they make a comment like that.
Sure.
And there is a treasure trove of literature on this concept out there.
Well, I'd like to dig into it. Go ahead.
Did you want to get something in there?
No, let's just keep right on that concept, because I think, again, like you said, not to just, paint this broad brush of everybody who's, criticizing you and things like that. But for a lot of the work that you've done, and maybe this is just more of stroking your ego, but with all the work that you've done, how much is actually done in the theonomic community and things like that. I mean, some people should know that you do your homework before you just come up with an idea. So it's like, I just don't give much credit all to that. But to keep on the concept of the Cherem Principle, just as like kind of like a brief thing for people who haven't really heard anything of it, what is that? What is the Cherem Principle kind of saying in a nutshell?
Absolutely. The Cherem Principle basically is showing that there is how do I succinctly put it? The Cherem Principle is the doctrine of the most holy place. It is the judicial declaration of something as most holy in the Old Testament. I didn't fully make that out in my other book, but this one will definitely lay it out. The main law for it is in Leviticus 27, verses 28 and 29. And God can declare something to be Cherem, or people can declare something to be Cherem, in which case certain things follow. If you Cherem a piece of land or a house or property or cattle or whatever to the Lord, it is for the Lord and for the service of the temple, and you can never buy it back again. That was different than the doctrine of dedication, which made something holy and became useful for the priests in the temple, but you could buy it back again if you paid 20% interest on it. Once you made something most holy, though, and devoted it or Cheremed it, it was permanent, and there's a whole lot that comes out of that. Now, that was also important. Basically, a sacrifice was of this nature. When you brought a lamb or whatever to sacrifice to God, you were, by definition, making it Cherem, and at that point, it was sacrificed to death, and it was sent to God, quote unquote, by killing it, offering its blood, and burning it on the altar. And the incense, or the ascension of the smoke that goes up, was symbolic of it ascending up to the most holy place in heaven. Again, you've got to study Leviticus deeply. You'll read your Bible and it says the whole burnt offering, the whole burnt offering, the whole burnt offering. The word in the Hebrew is the olah, and olah in Hebrew means ascension, or to ascend. Okay, it is an ascension offering because you're burning it completely, and the whole thing is ascending up to the Lord. That, of course, if that doesn't invoke something from Christian theology, I don't know what would. That's right. And it certainly makes more sense, doesn't it? Christ is sacrificed, and then he ascends up to the Father. And so sacrifices were of this nature. And if God declared someone to be Cherem, that meant judicially they were symbolically to be brought across the threshold of the most holy place. Well, let me ask you, what happens when you walk into God's presence?
You die.
Yeah.
Unless you're covered by the blood, unless you're approaching him in the way God has prescribed.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I lay this out in the book in the early chapter, a crash course in most holiness.
Okay.
Only the priests can go into the holy place and administer and make sacrifices and whatever. Only the high priest could go in, and only once a year, and offer blood on the throne room of God. Right? That was God's designated way of this of being approached. And of course, our high priest is Christ. He does this for us. So Christ can go into the Holy of Holies, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's a perfect sacrifice, etc. But if it was you, apart from God's designated way of approaching him, you go into the Holy of Holies, you're dead. Okay? Because what you've done is you've denied God's prescription for how to approach him. You've approached him on your own terms, on your own works, and you have to bear your sin alone. Mm. So in a sense, you become the sacrifice.
Mm. Wow.
That's why Paul tells these people in Hebrews that are about to turn away from the Christian faith and give up on it after all these years before everything happens like he said it would. He says, don't turn away. Don't turn your ear away from him calling coming for you, because if you do, there remains no more sacrifice for your sins, which is to say, you're going to be the sacrifice.
Wow.
That's what happens to the city of Jerusalem. It's destroyed by God's, okay? And this law was prescribed in symbolic ways in the Old Testament. If you committed apostasy, which means you defied the covenant, or if your entire city turned against God and became an idol-worshiping city, you were prescribed to be the whole city destroyed. Now, we know this was not a standard equitable death penalty for some kind of an injustice. Why? Because it wasn't just the idolaters who were killed. It was the idolaters and their wives and their children, and the entire city was to be burned. And it says everything in it, carry the furniture out, carry the couch out, throw the TV set out, bring the cattle, put it in a big pile, and burn the whole works. Okay? This is not just justice between individuals. This is not just about protecting society.
Yeah.
This is a symbolic sacrifice holy unto the Lord of judgment. And in fact, there's a little controversy over this, but most scholars recognize that in the Deuteronomy 13 verse, when it says to bring the whole city out and burn the whole thing, that word whole in the Hebrew actually is referencing the whole burnt offering. It is burn it as a whole burnt offering as unto the Lord. So it's connecting the ceremonial law to it.
Right. Wow.
So this is where the Cherem doctrine comes in to all these death penalties in the Old Testament that obviously bring a red light to us today. Blasphemy, witchcraft, apostasy, rebellious cities, and others. Why was this the case? Well, God was saying through his law the whole time that this is a ceremonial judgment for a reason. You know, it's descriptive of what happens when you turn away from God, and there's a whole explanation that comes out of that.
Okay.
And it's my argument that because they are, in most of those cases, by the way, the word Cherem is directly invoked.
Yeah.
So we know this is the Cherem doctrine coming into play. It's not invoked when it talks about put a murderer to death.
Okay.
A rapist ought to be put to death. That's just, it's completely separate. It's common.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are principles of common justice. But when God wanted to invoke the imagery of the final judgment, so to speak, of his altar fire judgment, then he brought in the word Cherem, or the symbolism of it. When those laws appear in the Old Testament, we begin to see they take on a different tone. And it's my argument that those death penalties no longer apply in the Old Testament. The standards, God's standards for common justice do continue.
Okay. No, that's really good. Do you got anything else?
Yeah, I was going to ask for some examples in the Old Testament and the New, and you covered both. So,
nice.
Well done.
Well, and I think
any more in the book that I didn't get to in the old book. Of course, I only had a section of a chapter in the other book, but in the new book, it's thorough. It's every prophecy where it shows up. It's every New Testament, and there are many New Testament areas where it seems to be peeking through, but it doesn't say it explicitly. Yeah. The stoning of Stephen is a very clear one. You know, they're stoning him in their minds for a Cherem penalty.
Wow.
But in reality, he's the one that has all of them on trial. And when he dies, where does he look? Straight up and sees Christ. What is that? That's the Holy of Holies in heaven. Yeah. It's symbolizing the transfer of the authority of the earthly temple, which is no more, to the authority of the heavenly holy place.
Yeah.
So, and then the Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah. This
mysterious death, directly tied to the Cherem doctrine, in my views. And I explain that in the book. And there are other instances.
Well, I'm glad you brought that one up, because a good buddy of mine who I used to work on staff with at a church would use that story to tell his daughter not to lie, because that's what God does to liars.
Oh my God.
He was joking, but it happened.
But it happened. One thing that kind of catches me about all this, and it's something that a lot of people probably like, well, who cares? Why are we talking about this? This seems such a deep thing, and it's like, well, what's the big? It actually, completely enthralls me, because when you think about, the theonomic, view of bringing, that the Old Testament laws are still valid and things like that. Well, now you're getting into an aspect where it's like, okay, well, if the penalties still apply, then we're talking some serious penalties for, some things that are going on. So this is, I think, an extremely important thing to talk on, because it's like, well, how do we figure out, we don't want to start sentencing people to death for, apostatizing and things like that. So it's like, what do we, how do we actually look through this? I mean, this can actually be very serious stuff. So it's a good thing to be going through and to be.
Yeah, I think, hey, Joel, I don't know if you agree, but I read a lot of criticisms when The Bounds of Love came out, and Martin Salbrides was on Chalcedon was my favorite one. It was obviously the most charitable. He loves you. That's apparent. Yeah. But he made a good point. One of the reasons it's so important to even be discussing this stuff, especially as Reconstructionists, because we're calling for government starting from self all the way up to the state. So we're implying that we care about what the penal laws or what the sanctions are. But he made a good point. Like, one of the reasons it's so important is because you could fall into one of two ditches on either side of the road. That is, one, execute somebody who didn't deserve it, or two, not execute somebody who did deserve it. So we need to get it straight.
Well, then if you execute somebody and then it's not, it wasn't permissible, then you're engaged in willful killing of an innocent person. Then
Yeah, I think that's true. And I'm not sure exactly where this originated. Someone said it was in the rabbinical writings from way back, but I tend to agree with it. It's better that 100 guilty men go free than that one innocent man is put to death. Yeah. So I tend to be a little more lax on that. And this is a point that Vern Poitras made in his book, and Bahnsen just ripped him for it, and I was a little embarrassed because Bahnsen should have seen their. Yeah, of course we want to get God's penalties right. Of course we want God's justice right. But if that means we're killing a lot of people, and by the way, then it turns out we're wrong, it's like, that's kind of a pretty big oops to have on your resume.
Yeah. Right.
So, I mean, and honestly, I believe, here we are, well over a generation into this theonomy thing. If you start with the publication of Rushdoony's Institutes in the modern era, talking 1973, so what are we into that? Some 40-something years, 45, 6 years. And it's not like theonomy's taken over the theological world. Right. And it's my opinion, God's not going to give us dominion, so to speak. I hate to use that word in that way, because that's not really what it means. But God's not going to give us success in the public sphere until we do get it more right. Yeah. And if we are wrong, we better be wrong on the side of mercy and leave the rest to God than be wrong on the side of tyranny and have to have God's wrath for that reason.
I think that's a great point. For the same reason that we wouldn't give my 4-year-old son a machine gun, right? Like it's dangerous. It's a useful tool, and it's a dominion tool, but you're gonna hurt somebody. Calm down.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think for many reasons, I tried to start describing in the old book, Bounds of Love. The theonomy world, the Reconstructionist world, has done that to a large degree, because they're so gung-ho to repeat the lost world of the Covenanters, or to repeat the lost world of the Scottish or the Southern Presbyterian Church, or whatever group it is that you idolize and have lived in that tradition. You want to go back and say, yeah, these guys had it right, and finally we're going to get theonomy and get all this back. And I'm sorry, 90% of what I'm hearing from those quarters in many cases is tradition. And then the other side is that the culture war guys, they love theonomy because it means we get to go kill the homos and finally take care of these stupid gay pride parades. So I'm sorry, I'm not with you on that one. I have a different take on how that ought to be addressed. And, you might just have to back up and say, maybe we have all these problems because of a deeper underlying problem of God's law of our own.
Right.
And if you've read my work on the problem of slavery in Christian America, you might know where I'm going with that. So we've had all these great Christian traditions infused deeply with sin, and then when we're called out on our sin, we dig our heels in, start culture wars, and there's just this lack of repentance in our hearts that I just don't think God's going to prosper us until we heal that first. When I look at the vision of the kingdom of God, there in Revelation 22, of the temple of God with the tree of life and the rivers flowing out into the world in all directions. This is a recreated Garden of Eden, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. They're not there for the killing of the homos and the exiling of the blasphemers or whatever. They're there for healing. That is an inside-out work.
Yep.
That is a work that requires you to get out of your quarantine lifestyle, your little Christian ghetto, and get out there with the dirty people who need medicine and mingle with these people. I'm working on an article in my head that I'm going to publish, hopefully in the not too distant future, of Jesus touching the leper. Okay, he reaches out and he touches the leper and heals him, and that is the absolute reverse of what the Old Testament law called for. Mm-hmm. You were not supposed to touch that guy, else you would contract his uncleanness. But Jesus is the temple of life. He's the tree of life, and the life flows out of him and heals the nations. But you got to have the boldness. You got to have the, shall I say, the balls to reach out and touch the leper.
Yeah,
that's what we're afraid of. We are afraid of someone who's a homosexual.
Yep.
We would rather curse them and marginalize them and clean up our streets, so to speak, than to try to find ways to heal them. And that's what God's called us to do. That's where the dominion's at. And that tells me that really what a lot of our guys have been are a scared little boy on the inside with a hard shell on the outside.
Wow.
We put on our pretend crusader profile pic on Facebook, pretend that we're some tough guy. What in reality you're scared of everything inside. You have no dominion over your own soul and your own emotions that you can go out and deal with these problems. Yeah. I would say maybe if I do write the next book, maybe it will be on a book of self-government, because I think that's where we failed the most. Yep. Certainly in the need for a more refined version of what theonomy is. Certainly I've spent a lot of time doing that, but we need a book on self-government that deals with spirituality and family life and how to deal with the weak and all that kind of stuff.
How much more you got? You want to? We don't want to take up too much more of your time either.
I want to jump into some of the things that he just talked about.
I do too. I'm kind of over the exegetical stuff. That stuff was so important.
Well, but Cherem,
go ahead.
Cherem applies exactly to what he's talking about, because even here you talk about you talk about sexuality in here and how it applies to the Cherem Principle and those things and I was actually going to go there like, hey, I want to talk about sexuality, because a lot of people think theonomists want to just go out
and stone homos.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I first heard of it, that's exactly what I thought. Mm-hmm. Like, you guys just want to go stone homosexuals. That's what you want to do, and because that's how it comes off.
Well, and I think there's probably certain camps within. I mean, because that's what the one thing I've learned upon like the of reading and looking into different things is you have a broad spectrum of
just
people
like
when it comes. Exactly,
absolutely.
You have like the I think as it was Doug Wilson that put it, high octane. You have like the really hardcore people who are all about that, and they might be that way of just going, hey, we got this, like Joel said, we might just have this excuse to go out and stone homos, because I don't want to have to deal with that problem anymore. But there is a lot of nuance that has to go into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we were kind of talking about this earlier, like 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul talks about, to the Gentile, I've become, like, how does he say it? To those under the law, I've become one under the law, and those not under the law, I've become... And it's almost like, it's this language of, he's like, man, I'm meeting people at where they are, and he's bringing the gospel, and the gospel is that healing power that you're talking about in Revelation 22. And the reason he's able to do that is really, to some degree, is because of kind of what you're talking about here, this Cherem Principle. He's allowed to go and do that and be that guy and do the hard thing and touch the leopard, and it's incredible in a lot of ways.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so, but go ahead. I didn't mean to, but
no doubt this concept is very personal.
Yeah. And
one of the sources I've used, one of the modern sources published just last year that deals with Cherem doctrine. Mm-hmm. At length, it goes on to say, there's New Testament applications of this, and I follow them too, because obviously I was already there mentally, that, what in the New Testament is wholly devoted to God? It's obviously the sacrifice of Christ, and he goes up into the most holy place, but who's sitting there with him? Ephesians 2 tells us, you are resurrected with Christ, and you are seated with him in the heavenlies. Mm-hmm. You are called to be consumed by his Holy Spirit fire. You're called to be wholly devoted to the Lord. Yep. So what does that mean? What is this language Peter uses when his people are in persecution? And he says, you're being refined like silver, so that the dross will be burned away and you'll be refined even purer than you were. That should be in our lives all the time, that we are constantly being refined by God's fire. and all of these things, so that the sacrifice is turned inward first. There's a desire for greater holiness in my life, to be like I am definitively set where he's at. So there's all that angle, but some of my greatest critics, some of my most outspoken critics, especially on social media, seem obsessed with this angle that Joel has taken away the ability of the civil magistrate to avert God's wrath. Through, and of course, the implied part is through getting rid of the blasphemers and the homosexuals.
That's right.
See, and it's like the more some of these people criticize, they're lending fuel to those people who look at theonomy and say, like you just mentioned, you all just want to kill all the homosexuals. And while some of these critics are just making their point for them, because that's what they're doing. And I'm like, no, this is completely wrong. And all of the leading theonomists have always said, Rushdoony, North, Sutton, Gentry, all the writers have always said, this does not succeed in society unless regeneration happens first. So until you get to that point, you can forget tweaking the social order and the civil laws, because you're just going to institute one more top-down tyranny. So all of these things have to go together, and it has to be Spirit-driven. If it's not driven by the Spirit in the Great Commission, it's not really going to be biblical theonomy in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think, that is just so good. Rushdoony said all the time, like, I'm scratching, this is the tip of the iceberg. We're scratching the surface here. He made it clear that it was going to be the second, third, and fourth generations after him that we're going to get into the meat of it. And you mentioned it earlier, the desire to want to go back and keep upholding the idols of certain traditions and certain groups. That's exactly what Rushdoony and all the boys wanted to avoid. We were trying to progress and get farther, not go back, right? And so when I'm on Facebook, and I think it's interesting. I don't know that any, maybe outside of Christendom or whatever, but I think it says something that we're to the point now where a guy like you, who's a scholar and's got some books under his name and all that, is actually even addressing a Facebook critic, a social media critic. And that's not to say that I don't think you should have. I love that you did. But it says something about the age that we're in that you're even taking seriously. And to their credit, I know we don't need to say names, but I know who your top critics are on Facebook. There are two that I think you mentioned in your book that you address. And I think it's important because we're to the spot now where I've learned more on Facebook from guys like you, and like I call him like one of my teachers, Joseph Foreman. Just hearing his love and his compassion and his grace for people, being a theonomist. I've learned more on Facebook in the past 2 years than I did in Bible college that I spent $65,000 on, and I'm going to be paying for until Jesus comes back. You know what I mean? So I love that we're in that age. But a guy like a guy like Foreman, another guy that I just love is a guy like Tim Yarbrough. These are guys that get that regeneration, that all theonomists say that reconstruction starts with self. But some of these guys, I think the elders of our camp are much better at showing it and talking about it and teaching it.
Yeah, there are some that certainly are of that nature. I would love nothing more than to have a professor somewhere and be buried in an office in books and never talk to anyone. I say that, probably not true. Have a classroom life and have a pretty quiet life. I would be happy to do that.
Yeah.
Because when I write, I want to write for other scholars and influence other scholars. But and you will also notice I don't spend a lot of time arguing on Facebook. I don't get involved in deep, long threads back and forth because I don't have time for it. I feel like I'm not meeting my real calling if I'm doing that. But I don't say that that's a bad thing. There are people called to do that. And nevertheless, I have to get out there because name the handful of PhDs, scholars that you know who have made an impact in this world. I'll tell you who they are. They're Jordan Peterson, okay, Jonathan Haidt, and I can give you a handful of others that are on social media all the time. There are people who actually have an active social life on social media with millions of people. Jordan Peterson right now is probably the best single example of that, despite the fact I would have many disagreements with him.
Of course.
He recognized this early. Put your class lectures online and just stream them out there for free. The guy's a multimillionaire set for life because of this, and he's impacting millions of people around the world. Well, just like this little podcast right now, you can't take the theology that I'm teaching, and it's not because it's me, it's just because the theology's there. Nobody's teaching this in-depth stuff at this illuminating level anywhere.
Nope.
But you can take this single podcast, and with a cheap handheld smartphone, you're going to reach people in India, China, Africa. Okay, the potential is here, and it's coming on stronger and stronger by the day. Remote tribes in desert India.
Well, you're giving a lot of credit to this podcast, man.
It's not the podcast; it's the medium.
Right.
It's the ability to get this stuff out, and the proliferation of the smartphones right now, all over Africa, by the millions, by the hundreds of millions in India and China. If you think our little reform circles here in America that are listening to this, are where it's at, you don't understand Christendom right now. Mm-hmm. The church in China is bigger than the entire church-going population in America on Sunday. Yep. The underground church in China, and most of them are conservative evangelical. And this is it's just crazy. It's all over the world, and the opportunity is amazing. So one little podcast like this, or any podcast that's got goods, somebody can pick that up and pass it around, and it's going to reach all over the world. Yep. So one of you were praying earlier, thank you, God, for this technology. I mean, it's a godsend. It really is. So it's phenomenal, and we live in a day and age where it's easy. And when I was at AV, I tried to put most of the books I was writing currently to have some kind of a free online version, because I want the stuff out there.
Yeah. Well, Joel, is there any other questions that you guys have to ask today? Because I feel like that's
I have one that's just simply a closing one. So if you got anything else to say before.
Yeah, I was just going to say we really, really appreciate you coming on. Obviously, it's been really cool. We love your books. We love your articles. We've been reading them a long time. It's been fun for us because Joey and I, especially, and one other family that we moved from Southern California with to Alpena, Michigan, we felt called by God to come here, and we are committed to making disciples wherever we are and loving people wherever we are. And so when we think about coming to a new town completely far away from where we were born and raised, especially me being within the Reconstructionist camps for 3 or 4 years now, I think seriously about how are we gonna love this small town, which is very affectable. It's small enough to where a couple of guys with a microphone and a heart for Jesus can actually have some effect. And I just wanted to say before you go, Restoring America is super, super important to thinking through how we love our neighbors here. And I don't know that a lot of people think about in a loving your neighbor's term, but when you think about what's fair and taxes and real money and all that, it was just really, really important.
Yeah. And that's great. It's a great book, still a wonderful book, great for reaching your small town. But when you're going to talk about how you love your local community, you got to go back to our opening question. And Restoring America 2.0 will have a whole chapter on barbecue. All right?
Yes!
That's what I'm talking about, man.
Oh, man.
That's creating that community.
Meals. So that's what I would say. Feed them.
That's
Feed
right.
them, bring them, and then reach them.
Yep.
Awesome.
Hey, Joel, could we have you on again sometime?
Absolutely.
Great.
Cool. Just to close us out, in a lot of the talks that we're doing right now, I think the biggest thing that comes out of it is learning love, is learning biblical love, what God has called us to. And so there's a verse, Romans 13. In Romans 13, 8 and 10, I just want to read this quick. It says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." I love that you titled this last book, The Bounds of Love. Could you just real quick, give us kind of this, how is God's love really connected to his law, and what does that really mean for the gospel and then going forth?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you just said it there. They're intimately tied together. The command to love is in the law, and loving is fulfilling all of the law. So it's kind of this interconnected thing, and God's love is not just an emotion. Now, I would go back and amend the book, actually, where I said it's not an emotion, it is an action. It's both. And we need to take greater account of our emotions. I should probably go back. But we have this, what I meant to combat is this notion today that when you say I love you, you have a feeling towards somebody. And it pretty much ends there. But God's love is an active love. It's an action. It is giving. It is selflessness. It is sacrifice. It is all these things. If you back up to the beginning of that narrative in Romans that you just read from, that line of thinking goes all the way back to chapter 12, verse 1, where he says, "Therefore, brethren, beseech you by all the theology taught in chapters 1 through 11. Therefore, this is what you're going to do. Present your body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service." There's your Cherem doctrine again, by the way. Oh. But you're a living sacrifice. Yeah. You're a living sacrifice, which means you keep going. Yeah. And so, and then if you continue reading that chapter, he tells you how to do this in every setting, how to love, how to be transformed for yourself, how to love your brethren, how to love those outside the church, and then how to love those who are persecuting you and stealing from you. And he says, don't take vengeance privately. That's not your job. Vengeance is God. And then he gives us Romans 13. Okay? The civil magistrate has a role here. Yeah. And then winds it up with the verse you just read. Love your neighbor, because that's fulfilling the law. So I always teach that whole thing is one big seamless whole. And it begins by presenting your body as a living sacrifice.
That is awesome. Well, Joe, thank you so much for being on. Hopefully, we'll get you on again sometime soon. Because this is great, and I think we can, pick at your knowledge and stuff for hours upon hours. But we want to respect your time, and but this has definitely been good. It's been fun.
Hang on the line, and we'll say goodbye to you off the air.
All right, man. I appreciate it, guys.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right, outset of the interview. That was a lot of fun, guys. Final thoughts? Do you have any...
Joey, 30 seconds, final thoughts. Joel McDurmon, in your brain.
He's a wealth of knowledge. The amount of history and study that he has done is incredible.
Yeah, that's definitely one reason why I wanted to ask that question about some of the history behind, because he is well versed in it, and it's important to know. I mean, it's important to see that there are some of these things that have shaped certain thought.
And you know what I would say? The best time to interview someone on a specific principle is while they just finish writing like the larger book of that principle.
Yep. Yeah.
Because watching him put all the pieces together in his mind was rather incredible. I mean, it was it was fascinating to watch. And yeah, you ask him one question, you have all these follow-up questions. Is like, hey, I have this line of reason. Like, I'm going to ask these questions in order so we all, we get where we want. And then he answers all of it, and he's putting it together all at the same time. And you're like, man, that was
I like how you said that he just pours a bucket right on the question.
So it was good, man. Appreciate him. And you know what I appreciated the most was hearing his heart at the end of it.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when we had that conversation about sexuality and some of that stuff. Yeah. It was cool, man, because this dude he's a scholar.
Let me ask you this, because I know as much as you fight it, you don't identify as a theonomist. So let me ask you this question, and maybe you can answer it kind of on behalf of non-theonomists. Was it relieving for you a little bit to hear kind of a spearhead of theonomy talk that way?
And it very much.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there's biblical reasons as to why I would agree with him, and I think Joel and I are probably really close, and I actually really enjoyed his thing, but it was because I think we're the aroma of Christ, man, and the gospel it does offend people, but it has incredible healing power, and it's man, when I hear the rough side of theonomists be like, man, we're killing off homosexuals, and it's like, what if they're the elect?
Right.
Like, what if they just haven't arrived to that yet?
Where's the grace? Where's the mercy?
What if, you know what I mean? We're pulling them out way too fast. This is crazy.
Yeah. Well, and then it goes back to what Paul says. When he's describing all these sinners essentially, and these sins and stuff. He says, "And such were some of you."
Right.
And he's talking about these, and it's but he's speaking to believers. He's speaking to Christians, and you're right. When we don't give them the chance, when there's none of the grace, there's none of the love, the mercy, and I loved how he got into love, and asking that question at the end, because it's important. That is, it's the gospel. A lot of that comes into play. It's full-orbed.
Yep. Amen.
Jesus pulls us towards himself.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he also he like romances us in a sense, and he's like, dude, look at the grace that I have here. And at some point when that heart change happens, you're just running towards him now, and it's like, man, you could see what he's done for you. And that's like the part of that's the impact that the gospel has that really feeds the Christian community. And it's important for us, I think, for Christians to obviously preach the message of the gospel so that impact can happen, and be willing to walk with people and have conversations. Dude, if it takes 5 years for someone to come to Christ, and then it takes 5 years, I would hate for someone to be executed because of an action they've done or whatever. I mean, and you and I've talked more, and it would be really hard to do that anyways. And so I don't want to paint this broad picture, but it was really helpful to hear that, and relieving in a lot of ways. And so
cool. Yeah, I'm super excited about just seeing what he writes in the new book and fleshes that out so much more. I think, and I knew this going in, but my big takeaway is this dude is no exegetical slouch.
No.
He puts in that dirty work, and he knows all the stuff. You're not going to run a passage by him often that he hadn't considered or looked into. As far as scholarship goes, he's not mailing it in at any point in his study. And so whether you come to agree with him, and you brought this up about his critics, and I think whether you come to agree with him or disagree with him, you can't brush him off. You can't write him. You can't write him off as saying like he didn't put the work in. He's just no slouch.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Anything else?
That'll do it.
All right, listeners, definitely go check us out on YouTube, on Facebook. Go to Reconciled Media for any of our happenings. Check out the audio-only sections of the podcast on iTunes and Spotify. And also, a quick plug, we didn't get into it during the interview, but Joel, if you want to support him, you want to see what he's doing, go check him out on Patreon. You can actually check him out there at Joel McDurmon on Patreon. If you've been blessed by this interview, if you've been blessed by him, by his content, his books, anything like that, go definitely help him out. Definitely, see the continuing of the work that God hopefully has for him. So.
Yeah, and you can expect Consuming Fire to come out hopefully within the next month or two.
Yeah, and we'll definitely try to get him on when that book comes out.
Yeah, part 2. We got to talk covenants in part 2.
Yep.
We got to talk continuity a little bit more with the covenants, and we need to talk about with the Cherem Principle. I want to know. Okay, well let's talk brass tacks about the civil magistrate. Let's talk about it. How does it work itself out?
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
And barbecues.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh man, that was awesome. That's a good part. Okay, so Christians, go cultivate. Really?
Go ahead. All right.
I don't want to now.
Christians, go cultivate a kingdom culture.